The Lords of Red. There was a time long ago when the Orokin Empire was still rising, when conquering the stars was no longer a fool's dream. The Orokin had long since wanted to spread their dominion as far as possible, which caused them to seek out other worlds and establish their superiority, as well as colonies for research and labour. One of these worlds was Mars, which the Orokin had discovered was populated by a previously unknown civilization known as the Hegnor. According to the Orokin researchers later on, the Hegnor had discovered fire and even developed a very crude glyph-based form of written language, but they were found to be utilising primitive tools, such as stone hammers and pieces of flint. This proves to be particularly advantageous to the Orokin in the future, since this would mean that exterminating the Hegnor would not be necessary to take control of Mars due to the significant technological difference. Discovery of the Hegnor occurred when an Orokin research unit discovered traces of a former settlement on Mars, carved entirely out of the Mars' basalt surface. Samples were taken for carbon dating, which revealed that rock formation nearly predated the Orokin Empire. To this day, nobody knows how the Hegnor came to be on Mars, as the Hegnor themselves never made records about how or where they came from, instead using their written glyph language to pass down their culture and teachings onto the next generation. One proposed theory is that life on Mars simply evolved on its own independently from the Orokin's birth and evolution on Lua, which would remain undiscovered until the Orokin finally decided to travel beyond their home. Another theory is that the Hegnor civilization are not native to the star system at all, instead either being the remnants of a crashed colony ship from an unknown world, or that Mars was once visited by another space-capable species before the Orokin ever came to be. Regardless of origin, at the time any potential Martian natives were assumed to be extinct or too insignificant to be considered a threat to the Orokin upon discovery of abandoned settlements, leading to the Orokin High Council sending planetary terraforming devices to Mars, with the express purpose of converting Mars into a habitable planet for future Orokin colonists. First contact was established when the onboard security systems of the deployed devices detected a breach, which upon investigation by Orokin researchers, revealed that several of the Hegnor had broken into the enclosures and built homes for themselves. The natives, although unable to properly communicate, welcomed the Orokin as royalty, going as far as to depict the Orokin as gods with their crude glyph drawings. This incident was reported to the Orokin High Council, who hesitantly decreed that the Hegnor should not be exterminated, but instead tamed and put to use for the Orokin. The Hegnor people were allowed to remain living in the planetary terraforming devices, and were even taught how to speak by the Orokin, but not without the cost. Once every summer solstice, Orokin soldiers would land upon Mars and abduct 10 of the Hegnor's people, taking them back to Lua for experimentation and early testing for the Technocyte infestation. At the time, the Hegnor people believed this occurrence was simply the Orokin choosing which among them would be worthy enough to ascend to heaven, joining the unimaginable bliss of the Orokin. This event was considered by the Hegnor to be so noble that they constructed statues out of the harsh Martian surface, honouring the Orokin researchers who had made first contact with them, referring to them as the Lords of Red as a form of reverence and power. However, this peace did not last. One day, the Lords of Red disappeared from Mars. The remaining Orokin personnel disappeared soon after. Abducting the Hegnor people became less and less frequent until eventually, it stopped altogether. The terraforming device on Mars became abandoned by the Orokin, eventually collapsing altogether from the lack of maintenance and repair, resulting in the deaths of multiple Hegnor people as well as the destruction and loss of precious plant life and water within the terraforming environments. The Hegnor would never learn the truth, but the Orokin were forced to abandon Mars due to the rising threat of the sentience they were facing, and they could no longer afford to spend resources on Martian savages. Forced to revert to their old ways, the Hegnor began to curse the Lords of Red, screaming at the stars and begging for the golden skymen to descend upon them once again, and return their homes, their family, and their children. But of course, their screams did nothing. Abandoned by the Lords of Red, and with no further Orokin influence, the Hegnor were left alone on Mars for the remaining duration of the Old War and beyond, remaining once again undisturbed on Mars for countless decades. The Hegnor would not be discovered again until the Grineer landed on Mars with the purpose of establishing military outposts on it, only to discover the remnants of the Hegnor still living on Mars. The Hegnor would have been exterminated then and there, were it not for the intervention of an Inaros Warframe, piloted by a still unknown operator. For the next 10 years, this rogue Inaros protected the Hegnor against all Grineer incursions, resulting in the Hegnor abandoning all hope of the Lords of Red ever returning, and instead choosing to worship this mysterious warrior as their god king. Even when infested spores arrived on Mars and threatened to eradicate all life within it, Inaros was always there to protect the Hegnor. Inaros rarely made any sort of communication, seeming to appear and disappear only to protect the Hegnor. Out of sheer devotion, the Hegnor built a temple to honour their newly founded god king Inaros, scribing the walls inside with their glyph language, retelling many stories and deeds of their god king Inaros. This would ultimately prove to be the Hegnor's last proof of existence. One fateful day on Mars, a moon-sized spore crash-landed into the Martian surface, spawning unimaginable amounts of infested. With no other way to eliminate such an extreme number of organisms, Inaros channeled all of his strength into creating a sandstorm big enough to be visible from space, tearing apart every last infested that came before him, at great cost to himself. Having sustained irreparable damage to the Warframe chassis, Inaros' operator was forced to cut the void link to the Warframe, causing Inaros to limply collapse. It is still unknown what happened to the operator, but the Hegnor gathered Inaros' remains and took him back to their temple, where they would guard what little remained of their god king until the end. This would in fact be the end of the Hegnor, as the Grineer would eventually return to exterminate every last one of them. In their final days on Mars, they cried out and prayed for their god king Inaros to return and save them once again. But of course, their screams did nothing. The Grineer slaughtered every last Hegnor on Mars, with the exception of Barakatir, who remains the only survivor of the Hegnor. To this day, the legacy of the Hegnor remains in the Martian ruins, and the Lords of Red remain forever gone from Mars.